Today on NPR News, we have Frank McCourt, a renowned author and teacher, well known for his Pulitzer Prize-winning memoir, Angela's Ashes. Hi, it's a pleasure to have you here today.
It's a pleasure being here.
So in your memoir, you focus on your impoverished childhood, but yet your writing retains a sense of humor throughout. Was this a conscious decision, or did it instinctively occur?
I really think it was just an innate part of living. I grew up constantly wet and hungry and cold and thinking about food, and often when one of the family was sick. We lived for a long time in a small house with the only lavatory on the street, and the stench was just absolutely terrible, and we'd have to close the door most of the time. If my father ever did actually get a job, he never brought his money home. He'd go off to the pubs and he'd drink it all away, so we pretty much never had any money. My mother was having way too many babies in too short a time, and the church and school had overwhelmingly harsh presence and constant all in our lives, and the masters with their slapping sticks if we did anything wrong, if we answered a question wrong, and the priests just instilling fear constantly and guilt. But being surrounded by this negativity all the time, you had no choice but to be hopeful. You had to have a sense of humor, or you would die. And although we were economically desperate, we had endless possibilities and dreams and inspirations, and we had our freedom on the streets and in books, and that was our wealth. And looking back on it now, I can say, that was funny, that was absurd.
Your father is very prominent in your memoir. In one quote, you state, "I think my father is like the Holy Trinity with three people in him, the one in the morning with the paper, the one at night with the stories and the prayers, and the one who does the bad thing and comes home with the smell of whiskey and wants us to die for Ireland." Did he change your life for the better or for the worse?
He was often absent, and when I did see him, he was one of these two distinctive people, either the alcoholic who collected his wages and lost his mind, or the perfect father, the one in the morning and the one at night. He'd read the newspaper by the fire and smoke a cigarette and drink tea, and at night he'd tell us stories, even though he was a few words, and he'd teach us different songs, and then he'd come home drunk after getting paid, and all the wages were gone, and he'd make us stand up and pledge to fight and die for Ireland, and he'd sing about Kevin Barry and Rodney McCorley, and it really showed me the good and bad examples of how I wanted to be when I grew up as a father. And at times I did wish for another father, someone like my uncle, Pa Keating, and sometimes I even wished for a different mother, but I wouldn't be the person that I am now if I hadn't been raised by them.
In total, 3 of your siblings died, Margaret and the twins, Oliver and Eugene. I noticed you named your daughter after your dead sister, Margaret. How horrible was it to watch your siblings die? How much of an impression did it have? Did you even realize the seriousness of the situation at the time?
No, not really. When I was a child, I didn't fully understand what was happening around me. When Margaret died and was taken away, I just thought it was like the dog in New York that had gotten hit by a car. I couldn't grasp why my mom would be bedridden after her death. We moved every time when a sibling died because my mom just couldn't stand to live in the same place that they had died in. But as I got older, around 13, I finally understood the grief when my friends died. When I was in the hospital with typhoid, I became friends with this girl who lived in the next room. Her name was Patricia Madigan, and we shared poetry through the walls. Then the nurses disapproved, so I was moved to be alone on the second floor, and she died 2 days later in the hospital laboratory. But I only mourned the loss of the poem about the highwayman that we had been sharing. And finally, when I was about 14, I was delivering telegraphs, and I met Teresa Camorti. She was 17 years old, and she had red hair and green eyes, and all the other delivery boys were afraid of catching the consumption from her, or what you would call tuberculosis, and therefore the job was passed on to me, junior. And I quickly became friends with her, and later lovers actually with her, and we had a grand time. However, she passed away a few weeks later, and I went to the priest and prayed and said it was all my fault and I hope she didn't go to hell. But I finally realized the seriousness of death. Mourning and grief, people tend to feel as they get older, and I finally understood my mother's depression and felt the weight of my sibling's death.
Alongside telling a story of poverty and strife, the memoir is also a coming-of-age story. How do you think the culture, especially the religion, in Ireland influenced your childhood?
I was raised Catholic in Ireland, and most of the adults there pretty much abhorred the Protestants in English for the wrongs they'd done us centuries before. So there was that discrimination. And my father constantly wanted us to act a certain way in public. He wanted us to put up a front. And that's a very Irish thing to do. There's just a lot of shame about our poverty and our begging and our sickness. And as a Catholic, you could say that we were raised to be guilty. If I made a simple mistake of any kind, someone would suggest I go to confess and repent. And at my first confession, I confessed the usual lying and hitting my brother and stealing a penny from my mother's purse. But this boy, Mikey Malloy, on my street had told me the story of Caitlyn and Emmer. And Caitlyn was this Irish hero who needed a wife. And I really admired him because my father had told me about him, bedtime or whatever. And Emmer was won his hand in marriage in this pissing contest. Literally, she peed the longest of everyone in Ireland, all the women. And I hesitated about telling the priest the story at first, but then I told him, and he laughed. And I asked the priest if my sin was the worst of everyone's, but he said I had a long way to go. And then at about age 16, I think my sins were at their worst, and I confessed everything to this priest this one day in this church, because they were just terribly burdensome. And it was relieving, because that was just how I was raised. To repent was very therapeutic. So in that way, religion was a positive, but it also induced a lot of guilt in me. So like my father as an influence, the environment in Ireland taught me a negative example that I wanted to reject as I grew up.
Some have said that your tone became sour and self-pitying in your follow-up to Angela's Ashes, Tis, which continues your story after your arrival in New York. Do you agree?
Being in New York, it was a shock. It was a new environment, and I think that's really reflected in my writing. Being around youth, I wanted to have a sense of authority with them, and in the beginning I was really straight-laced and reasonable, and I wanted the audience to feel those irrational, confused thoughts. So I would throw myself on the ground in pure exhaustion at the end of the day, and I guess my words became kind of sour and self-pitying, but I wanted it to reflect my true emotions at the time, so that the reader could actually see my growth into me actually valuing teaching, and the students themselves. It became exciting rather than draining.
So, hearing your students complain about their woes, how do you feel? Do you feel their complaints invalid? Do you want to interject?
No, of course, I can't tell them that their problems are irrelevant. We live in such completely different times and different places, and their hardships are not mine. But I've learned that my story can be relevant to their lives, despite the differences. They still live in a similar state of fear, except they hope helplessly to meet the expectations that have been set for them. My struggles with a broken family, with religion and poverty, with simply growing up are all transferable, universal themes. So I encourage them, my students, because I was never encouraged in my forwards through childhood. I hope to help them to some sort of breakthrough, and that's when I realized why I love teaching. And I want them, quite frankly, to follow their dream, to find their passion, or as Thomas Carlyle said, happy is the man who has found his work. I found mine work in writing and teaching, and am happy, and I hope everyone finds that, too. film that.
The feet. Some critics.
It's funny. That was absurd. We're done, Matt.
Yeah.
I didn't get that. Buy my memoir, Angel's Ashes, at your local bookstore. It won a Pulitzer Prize. Legit. Like, it's legit. Okay.